We have waited too many years, actually 15 years, to get back what they promised.
But we're not getting treated like family when we knowing that we've been putting blood, sweat, and tears into this company for 29 years I've been working.
In just 2 short months, American industry has been hit by a shock that's rippled across the nation. More than 300 factories, from long-established hubs in the Midwest to production centers along the East Coast, suddenly lost all their supply contracts with Canada. For decades, Canada was viewed as a stable, friendly, and reliable market for U.S. goods. But now, that door has slammed shut overnight. Orders that once moved smoothly across the border in a steady rhythm have been cancelled en masse. And not because American factories are less productive or uncompetitive, but because Canada has deliberately redrawn its supply chain map. This time, U.S. producers are no longer a priority. The shift stems from new trade agreements Ottawa has signed with the European Union, Asia, and South America. These deals open the door to suppliers offering lower costs, more flexible standards, and most importantly, far less political risk. The consequences are stark. U.S. businesses are being pushed out of Canadian supply networks, despite their once dominant role in trade. With Canada accounting for nearly 15% of America's industrial exports, this blow strikes at both commerce and jobs. Tens of thousands of workers now face reduced hours, temporary layoffs, or even outright plant closures. Factory towns are suddenly thrown into uncertainty as their main sources of income vanish. The risk of localized recessions is growing. At the heart of this crisis is Canada's comprehensive restructuring of its supply chains, and the United States is no longer part of that plan. For decades, the two countries shared one of the closest trade relationships in the world. US factories supplied Canada with automobiles, machinery, steel, and industrial components, goods that flowed north in a steady stream, forming an indispensable part of Canada's economy. But times have changed. Ottawa has now unveiled an ambitious national supply chain restructuring strategy designed to lessen dependence on U.S. imports, which are increasingly seen as unreliable due to trade disputes and political volatility. The goal is clear: diversify supply sources, keep prices competitive, and secure long-term stability. At the same time, the government is protecting Canadian industry by prioritizing contracts for domestic factories and newly chosen global partners. Behind this decision lies a decade of frustration. Washington has repeatedly imposed tariffs and trade barriers from lumber and dairy to autos and steel. Each White House change brings unpredictable policies. For Canadian businesses that require long-term stability, this risk has become unacceptable, combined with the fact that US production costs, from wages to taxes to energy, are significantly higher than in Europe or Asia. Canada has chosen a different path. That new path is already taking shape. Germany, Italy, and France are supplying advanced machinery and mining equipment. Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam are providing auto parts and electronics at prices up to 20% cheaper than U.S. goods. South America is now a growing source of raw metals at highly competitive rates. At the same time, Ottawa is tightening technical rules on US imports, creating costly new barriers that many American firms struggle to meet. The result is immediate. Within 60 days, U.S. contracts worth tens of millions of dollars have been cancelled or left to expire. Plants that once depended on Canadian orders are scrambling to find new buyers, often unsuccessfully. Sectors like automotive and machinery, long tied to northern demand, are taking the hardest hit. Ontario's auto industry, once almost fully reliant on US parts, is now rapidly reorienting toward European and Asian supply chains. This isn't just a trade adjustment, it's a structural shift, and for American factories, it could mark the end of an era. Now, orders for components and replacement parts are being reduced or redirected to new partners: Japan, South Korea, and Germany. To date, more than 70 U.S. metalworking and auto part manufacturers have reported revenue drops of 30 to 50% in just 2 months. Smaller facilities have already begun rotating worker furloughs as there simply aren't enough orders to maintain steady production. For decades, Canada was one of the largest markets for U.S. steel and metals, particularly from states like Pennsylvania and Illinois. Yet today, contracts for sheet steel, construction steel, and industrial aluminum have been cancelled and replaced with cheaper imports from the European Union and South America. The result: domestic U.S. steel prices have fallen by as much as 15% due to ballooning inventories, piling pressure on the entire metallurgical sector. Rust Belt mills are cutting shifts, directly hitting the livelihoods of thousands of workers. The situation is just as grim in lumber and furniture. The U.S. once dominated Canada's construction and consumer markets with sawn timber, plywood, and furniture. But American supply is now steadily being replaced by Nordic timber, Russian wood, and low-cost furniture from Southeast Asia, processing plants in North Carolina. Washington and Oregon have already cut output by 20 to 40%. Workers are facing layoffs and wage cuts, while forestry-dependent towns are sliding into decline. Machinery and equipment producers are also reeling. Canada, once a top buyer of U.S. mining machinery, agricultural equipment, and food processing systems, is shifting major contracts to Germany, Italy, and Japan. American makers of tractors, harvesters, and processing machines have lost 25 to 35% of their Canadian revenues. For small and mid-sized firms, that means scaling back operations, and in some cases, shutting down entirely. Even the food and beverage industry is under siege, once a stable market for us canned foods, soft drinks, and processed products. Canada now requires additional inspections and certifications, raising costs by 15 to 20%. Retail chains are turning instead to suppliers from Europe and Australia. As a result, U.S. food plants are scaling down production, triggering a ripple effect that hurts both factory workers and American farmers who supply raw ingredients. That damage doesn't stop there. When export contracts are cancelled, production lines stall, workers lose jobs, and raw material suppliers from farmers to metal producers lose their outlets. Transportation, warehousing, and maintenance companies tied to those industries also suffer within just 2 months. Hundreds of U.S. industrial communities are already feeling the squeeze, with the threat of localized recessions looming. And the effects ripple through everyday life. Factory closures and cutbacks mean lost wages. Families suddenly unable to afford rent, utilities or groceries cut their spending, dragging down local businesses from diners and auto shops to corner stores. Truckers and rail operators see shipments vanish, leaving fleets idle. Town budgets shrink as tax revenues fall, forcing cuts to public services. People are packing up and leaving for other states, draining local labor pools and hollowing out communities. The fear of permanently losing the Canadian market is no longer abstract, it's becoming reality. While some U.S. firms cling to hope that business will return once trade tensions ease, Canada has already moved on. Within weeks it secured stable supply lines from Europe, Asia, and South America. These partners not only offer cheaper goods, but also meet Ottawa's new technical standards. Canadian businesses have already adapted to new contracts, logistics, and systems. Reversing that shift would be costly and disruptive. Simply put, the U.S. is no longer Canada's default supplier, and while America scrambles to hold on, Canada is doubling down on its own domestic industry. Ottawa is pouring money into local farms, factories, and processing plants to replace what once came from across the border. For Washington, this isn't just a temporary setback, it's a long-term strategic loss. But Canada's shift isn't just about diversifying suppliers. It's also about reducing dependence on Washington's unpredictable trade policies. From quotas and tax exemptions to domestic procurement rules, Ottawa's measures are making it increasingly difficult for American products to regain a foothold. Even if tariffs are later adjusted, trust has eroded. During the transition, numerous U.S. orders were delayed or abruptly cancelled because of sudden changes in trade rules, leaving Canadian importers with heavy losses. Many companies once burned are reluctant to take the risk of returning to American suppliers after securing more stable partners elsewhere. At the same time, Canada is deepening its integration into major trade blocs, including the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership (CPTP) and the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement (CETA). These deals allow goods from member countries to enter Canada at lower tariffs. The U.S., notably, is not part of these agreements. That means American goods now arrive at a disadvantage, while rivals from Japan, Europe, and Vietnam gain easier, cheaper access to the Canadian market. All of this adds up to a troubling reality. Without consistent long-term changes from Washington, many U.S. businesses may never recover the market share lost in Canada. The long-term consequences for American manufacturing are becoming unavoidable. With a major export market pulling away, many factories have little choice but to scale down, suspend operations, or shut down entirely. And once a production line closes, restarting it is no easy task. Re-expanding capacity, rehiring staff, and rebuilding logistics all demand massive investment and time. Meanwhile, foreign competitors are quickly cementing relationships with Canadian customers, capturing the market America once dominated. It must be recognized that Canada's supply chain restructuring is not a temporary response to trade tensions. It's a deliberate, long-term strategy. Once Ottawa completes its new supplier networks, returning to U.S. manufacturers will no longer be a priority. If Washington fails to act, the risk of permanently losing access to the Canadian market will shift from possibility to certainty. The United States now stands at a difficult crossroads. The loss of export contracts from more than 300 factories is no longer an isolated trade issue. It has become a systemic supply chain crisis. To prevent further plant closures and mass job losses, Washington must move swiftly while also crafting a long-term plan to reclaim lost market share. Early steps are already underway. The Department of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative have opened talks with Canada to ease new technical barriers, including traceability requirements and stricter import licensing rules. At the same time, Washington is weighing legal action, possibly initiating a dispute under the USMCA on grounds that Canada's policies are excessively protectionist. On the support side, the White House is considering a large-scale relief package, wage subsidies to keep workers employed, tax breaks for exporters, and preferential loans for struggling companies. Meanwhile, heavily affected states like Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois are moving proactively to cushion their industries and lobby for urgent federal intervention. Several U.S. states have already sent trade delegations directly to Ottawa, pressing for more flexible solutions to protect their local industries. Some are even offering tax cuts or transportation subsidies to help manufacturers survive despite the collapse in Canadian orders. At the same time, states are working to diversify, exploring new markets in South America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia regions where demand for American industrial goods remains strong. From the business side, manufacturers are urgently adapting their strategies. Many are redesigning products to meet Canada's stricter import standards or redirecting exports toward emerging markets. Others are rolling out advanced supply chain management systems, fully digitizing data from raw materials to finished products, in order to comply with traceability requirements. Meanwhile, companies in the same sector are forming export alliances to share logistics, international marketing, and contract negotiation costs, a crucial step to cut expenses while revenues remain volatile. In the long term, the US knows it cannot rely too heavily on a single market like Canada. Expanding into Asia is increasingly seen as a strategic priority, given the surging demand for industrial goods in developing economies. Washington is also looking to use its economic and diplomatic leverage to secure new trade agreements with stronger protections for American exporters. At the same time, a key strategy will be shifting toward high-valuated products, advanced technology equipment, specialized machinery, and industrial systems that guarantee profitability even if export volumes decline. If the government and businesses act quickly and in unison, the losses can still be contained, and market share in Canada can gradually be rebuilt. But if delays continue or if short-term fixes remain the only focus, the loss of the Canadian market will stop being a warning and become a painful reality, wiping out tens of thousands of jobs and hundreds of factories from America's industrial map. Thank you for following this special report. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and share if you found this content useful. See you again in our upcoming bulletins.